All right, let's get started. I'm Bogdan. I coordinate activities of the Cold War International History Project here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'm an associate for the European Studies program and the History and Public Policy program at the center. We have today Bogdan, Lucian, and Jora, who is our third short-term Romanian scholar in a program sponsored by the Romanian Cultural Institute and hosted by the Woodrow Wilson Center. Dr. Jora is a research fellow at the Romanian Academy's Institute of International Relations, and he is a civil servant in the Romanian Ministry of Education. He worked as a visiting professor at Shandong University in China, Copenhagen University, and Bucharest University, earning his PhD in history with the thesis of Romania's cultural diplomacy in the interwar period. I believe about Jora University.
Yes, that's right.
One of my many alma maters. He will be talking today. It's a work in progress presentation of his time here at the Wilson Center, the 4 months he spent here at the Wilson Center. Bogdan, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard. Well, first of all, I would like to, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to, after almost 4 months spent at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, I would like to express my gratitude towards this outstanding academic institution whose work philosophy linking the world of politics with the world of ideas was my guiding principle when I started this research almost 9 years ago. I would like to express my gratitude also for the Romanian Cultural Institute, whose generous sponsorship and excellent relations with Woodrow Wilson International Center made my research stage here possible. Also, I would like to express my appreciation for my research assistant, Mr. Nicolas Patriciu, whose help in finding articles, books, and arranging interviews at the State Department was invaluable. Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars seems to be, and it was, the ideal place to perform such a research, having in mind at least two considerations: the access to the world's largest database, namely the Library of Congress, here including the US PhDs in the last 30 years, and the possibility to talk and interact with academics and practitioners. On the following half an hour, I will present you briefly some of my work in progress with the research on cultural diplomacy versus cultural propaganda. And I hope you will find my research findings, interesting, and will be a good start for a debate. On the following half an hour, I will present you first my motivation and approach, then the methodological challenges for a research of this kind, then the evaluation techniques for cultural diplomacy and cultural propaganda strategies, a short view at the terms, because they are confused and debated: cultural propaganda, cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy. They are often used in a confusing way in the bibliography I've met. And finally, briefly, the research findings at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As far as my approach is concerned, I came from the representation of history as a conflict prevention strategy. And have to have in mind that the issue of natural culture representation, namely the representation of national history in educational materials and towards a foreign audience, marked my professional career. My interest for this research subject is explained by the problem the region I came from has to face across the history, as well as now. More exactly, I came from a country and a region who's often producing more history than it can consume. Having in mind that the tragedy of Yugoslavia was caused, in my opinion, by a certain kind of cultural propaganda, by a certain kind of cultural representation of historical memory, you can easily understand my interest to start a research on the representation of history as a conflict prevention strategy, a subject, I repeat, with a particular significance for my native region, Transylvania, as well. The past, the historic heritage, and national identity and national culture are facts, but the way we represent them towards a foreign audience, but also towards our own public opinion, may create breaches of communication or, the worst, enemies. It may reconciliate or create further division lines. In my PhD research, I tried to investigate the different forms and aspects of Romanian cultural propaganda or cultural diplomacy in the interwar period, as they were reflected by the media, memories, and cultural attachés' secret reports. For instance, where I approach here the issue here at Woodrow Wilson during this almost 4 months of research stage, the issue of United States public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy towards problematic areas like the Middle East, I'm always referring to the investigation model coming from my Romanian experience. Just briefly, a few words about the actuality of the research team and its importance for the field of international relations. Well, I have to tell you that the issue of cultural diplomacy and cultural propaganda is still a terra incognita. It's still an issue uncovered by the social science research, neither by historians, neither by political scientists. And most, I was able to find out 3 PhDs on the Library of Congress on this issue, but most of them are just descriptive. I haven't found an analysis in terms of strategies, in terms of terminology, in terms of concepts, in terms of psychological approaches, so on and so forth. Also, have to keep in mind the fact that as far as the international relations are concerned, cultural diplomacy and cultural propaganda means power, namely the soft power, the power to obtain what we want through the power of seduction, attraction, expressing culture, lifestyle, and so on. Of course, the soft power as such and the capacity to persuade through the own civilization is nothing new, because it was well known in the antiquity, Middle Ages, so on and so forth, but it became a major dimension of power in the information era. Probably on the same way, oil was known also in the antiquity, but it became, a measure of power only in the industrial era, while the uranium was well known since the 18th century, if I'm right, but it became a measure of power, a symbol of power only in the nuclear age. Also, I have to remind you the fact that the recent events prove the fact that soft power is more actual than ever, because winning the peace is proved to be more difficult than winning a war or a military victory. And from this perspective, soft power, has a paramount importance. Machiavelli's expression 400 years ago, "It's better to be feared than to be admired," I think was proved wrong by the historical evolutions, including the most recent ones. Then came the perspectives to practically apply the research findings. Well, I think the biggest challenge for any social scientist is to link the world of idea with the world of politics, with another words, to see how his research results are transformed or converted into state policy. And as far as I'm concerned, I plan to publish a book with recommendation for the Romanian Cultural Institute and I hope to give at least a modest contribution to this outstanding institution who is leading a new cultural strategy for the cultural representation of Romania in the last 9 years. As far as the research methodology challenges are concerned, the most obvious one is the long-term perspective. Although we can have a short or medium-term perspective in this field involving changing attitudes and mentalities, we may need at least one generation to pass. To see real outcomes coming directly from cultural diplomacy campaign, we need, I've calculated, about 30 years of perspective, of historical perspective. Often what seems to be disastrous in terms of efficiency by the contemporaries or those analyzing these things from a short-term perspective may prove to be worth the effort in a longer-term perspective. I'm thinking about the results of the Romanian cultural diplomacy in the interwar period, which were always described by the contemporary reports as unconvincing, weak, and poor coordinated as compared with those of the Hungarians, Italians, or the Germans. But then here, after 70 or 80 years, what we see is that even today the most representative institution of the Romanian cultural diplomacy, namely Academia di Romania or the Romanian School in Paris, were created at that time. The most convincing scholarly work also. In a country like Italy, for instance, all 11 chairs of Romanian studies at university level were founded in the interwar period, and they still exist today. And in the last decades, they form a significant number of Romanian lobbyists in those countries whose help was invaluable in the last 2 decades. On the US case, if you are studying the reports regarding the United States information agencies during the 50s of the 60s, you will see that they were mostly complaining about the underfinanced and under-inspired US public diplomacy as compared with the one of the Soviet Union. Decades later, we have a different image of the United States Information Agency as being, the main, as being the institution who won the Cold War, despite the fact that it has only a fraction of the funds other dimension of power have had at the time. Definitely during the research as such, we are trying, me and Nick Patrici, we are trying to investigate and to obtain interview with officials from the State Department. And as we are expecting, they were a bit reluctant to cooperate for various reasons. But nevertheless, on the last day we succeeded to obtain a consistent interview regarding the US new strategies towards the Middle East, whose results I hope will have the time to present you here. The methodological difficulty to predict attitude and opinions. because, as you can imagine, we ideally, in order to measure influence, we'll need a control group or an experimental group, and also to take into account many variables, including political events and other factors which are out of control. And establishing, an experimental group, especially in certain countries, in certain environment, it came close, to an impossible mission, especially today. The unrepresentative opinion pools, and the best example which came to my mind now is the way different scholars were trying to evaluate the U.S. State Department public diplomacy campaign towards the Middle East countries in 2003 after 9/11, with the famous 10 video clips created by Charlotte Baer. Although they were not broadcasted, in most of the Muslim countries, I think they were broadcasted only in Indonesia and in Jordan. It was virtually impossible, to assess their effectiveness, towards the target audiences. Instead, they were practices some opinion polls, with students from the London universities or from various United States universities, whose opinion, as you can imagine, are quite unrepresentative and unconvincing. A general problem in terms of methodology may be also the fact that many social scientists used to attribute observable changes to a desirable outcome within the own model. Now, honestly, by analyzing most of the US State Department initiatives towards the Middle East on the last 5 or 6 years, I have nothing to complain. They will say they were inspired, they were in many ways the best they could do. However, we have to have in mind that the cultural diplomacy campaign will never substitute for what it perceives as bad politics, and the bad reputation of a political leader has an impact on the entire country. For instance, we need again a certain time perspective to assess, the effectiveness of those cultural diplomacy campaign. In terms of evaluating the efficacy of public diplomacy or cultural diplomacy campaigns or strategies, at the State Department they are working with 15 indicators, which I was trying to synthesize, in 3 baskets: a media tracker, an influence tracker, and a concrete changes tracker. But however, even this approach is quite weak, having in mind the fact that the media tracker may not work properly and may not give you an accurate image, especially in those countries where the media is not free. And most of the problematic countries, used to have a problem with censorship. The media tracker is not very representative even for the interwar period, because as far as I observed, from the secret cultural attaché reports, most of the favorable articles from the foreign mass media, were paid in a way or another. The influence tracker, as far as the individuals and opinion pools are concerned, again, I was talking about the opinion pools, they were quite unconvincing. The face-to-face interviews, especially in the most problematic environment, may not work for various reasons. Probably the most representative tracker is the concrete changes tracker, because you can see if in a school book there are positive changes. You can see if there is an increased number, of academic exchanges. You can see if there is or there is not a cultural agreement. As far as the terms are concerned, I observed that the term public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, is very rare use here in the United States, and is usually used the term public diplomacy, which in my view does not cover the entire spectrum of cultural propaganda or cultural diplomacy. Namely because cultural public diplomacy refers to what a certain government used to do for a foreign audience, without the intermediary represented by the public service of the target country, while the cultural diplomacy often may not involve the state. It can be performed by individuals, it can be performed by institutions, it can be performed by NGOs, it can be performed by individuals often against their own national government. Let's think what the East European diaspora meant during the Cold War for the cultural diplomacy of those countries, or what the Russian intelligentsia, people like Solzhenitsyn, meant for the cultural diplomacy of the Russian nation during the Cold War. Now I'll try to give you a brief look at the main characteristics of what they found to be cultural propaganda. In terms of approach, it emphasizes, a monologue and a one-way flow of information, which involves often the availability to talk but not to listen. The most obvious, sign are the expressions like "is clear," "everybody knows," "it's well known." As you can see, this kind of expression, when they are used in official documents, it's clear they are not inviting for a debate. They are not inviting. If you know everything, you are not debating. You are not willing to listen. The only thing you are willing is to persuade, to convince. Paternalism and arrogance, any monologue, and will create this impression, real or perceived as such, because because often we can be well-intentioned, but our discourse may be perceived as paternalist for various reasons. Often a cultural propaganda campaign, even if theoretically is designed for a foreign audience, is in fact designed to convince electorally, for electoral reasons, the own public opinion that something is to be done, and will be designed, in order to please the own public opinion, not the public opinion from the target audience. The goals are most often designed in terms of efficiency, and for instance they are short-term, and being short-term they are invasive. or at least perceived as invasive. Also, for a cultural propaganda campaign, the size of the audience is always less important than the influence of the audience. A reason related as well with the efficiency and immediate visible political results. As far as the cultural diplomacy is concerned, it can be defined the best, I think, in opposition with what cultural propaganda is. It involved dialogue and willingness to listen, a two-way flow of cultural influence. A willingness to listen in order to facilitate the mutual understanding, and above everything, and I underline it, the willingness to modify one's opinion as a result of the dialogue and debate. I colored it in red because I think this is the key factor explaining the difference between a cultural propaganda attitude and a cultural diplomacy attitude. I think any one of you, when he's participating in a debate or in a negotiation, if he's willing, to modify his own ideas, his own conception as a result of the debate or as a result of the dialogue, he's performing a cultural diplomacy action. Oh, I think I'm running short of time, so I'll try to be. It involves spontaneity, discretion, and genuine interest to do art for art. The political outcome is also different than in the case of cultural propaganda. It involves decentralization and de-diplomatization, and here I'll congratulate the United States new strategy of de-diplomatizing the libraries which are located overseas through the so-called American corners, which are taken out from the embassy buildings and organized in cafeterias, in small restaurants, in small libraries. This is a typical case of cooperation between a state institution and the private sector in order to be more credible and less perceived as a propagandist. A direct and unintermediate access to the other's culture. I think the most successful action in terms of cultural diplomacy were the international exchanges facilitated by travel facilities, facilitated by academic exchanges, facilitated by programs like work and travel, so on and so forth, which are facilitating an intermediate access to the other's culture. A perception of modest and discreet versus arrogant and invasive. A relaxed attitude versus a rigid attitude. A cultural diplomacy campaign will always try to reveal the complexity as opposed to a cultural propaganda campaign, which will emphasize always artificial simplicity. Cultural propaganda campaign will try to narrow the intellectual horizon, while a cultural diplomacy campaign will try to expand the intellectual horizon. And also, we can talk about the emotive selective narration and manipulation of images versus the accent for a debate, as in the case of cultural diplomacy. There is in fashion, the term branding, which is a kind of which is not cultural diplomacy but rather propaganda, taking into account the main commercial element and the logic of marketing. But I would rather define it as a well-intentioned propaganda, taking into account the fact that it's trying to ameliorate the negative stereotype, that is trying to create a positive image, to appropriate the people, to attract them in a logic of openness. And finally, I will tell you briefly in 2 minutes the additional research finding. I don't find a correlation between a country wealth or size and its power of representation. The effective cultural capital weighs less than the impact of its representation abroad. I don't see a direct correlation between directly allocated funds and the effective cultural presence abroad. The efficacy of cultural diplomacy discourse is affected by the instinctive tendency to address the message to a favorable public. And among the usual elements explain the hostilities towards own culture, I will call the paternalism, which is identified often with an arrogant attitude and complexes of superiority versus complexes of inferiority. And here we have the issue of reciprocity. But how can we have reciprocity between two unequal partners, between a gigantic in terms of culture, between the giant in terms of culture and media like the United States and a small country, for example? Usually in terms of cultural diplomacy effect, positive effects, we have always the Franco-German example, but those countries, are countries more or less equal in terms of size, in terms of culture, in terms of cultural power, so this example is a little bit forced. It's equally important to understand what is relevant for the local cultural environment. It's important to avoid the double standards or the perceived double standards of analyzing and approaching other cultures. The multi-perspectivity, this is a very important point. It involves the capacity to include in the own dialogue, in the own cultural diplomacy campaign, the other perspective, the other concerns, the other arguments, and it will lead finally to a debate. Or a different kind of engagement. Nevertheless, last but not least, the credibility of the messenger is equally important to the quality and credibility of the message. And as far as the United States cultural diplomacy and foreign policy is concerned, I think the new administration is well placed, to make a change, at least toward the problematic environments as the Middle East. Thank you very much, and I'm only ears, I will be happy to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Bogdan. Very much appreciate your presentation, and I look forward to the final product. Before I open it up to questions from all of you, I'm just say a couple of words, a few reactions to your presentation, and a few thoughts on the policy implications of cultural diplomacy. You began your presentation by stressing the soft power component of cultural diplomacy, and I think it's been generally understated in terms of international affairs in the past. We're no longer in a constant state of war. I don't think one could argue that even the Cold War wasn't really a constant state of war, but certainly after the fall of the wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the danger of war, despite whatever claims might be made as to the pervasive quality of the global war on terror, we don't live in a constant state of war, and in that respect, while war may very well be necessary at times and unavoidable, it is time-wise, it is finite. Culture and diplomacy and selling the American way to the public is probably the most recognizable representation of American influence abroad. There's the old dictum that two countries with McDonald's never go to war with one another, and I think after the NATO intervention in Serbia in '98, that may no longer hold true, or it may just be very well the exception that confirms the rule. I think the biggest challenge today facing the U.S. today is as you aptly pointed out, is winning the hearts and minds of the people that were liberated by either in Iraq or in Afghanistan, and it's certainly not a new problem. It's one of the challenges that the U.S. faced in Vietnam, certainly, if just to give one example. But it's a constant challenge and a constant struggle. The USAID mission in Vietnam is something that hasn't really been properly studied and properly credited for all the attempts it made to actually expand U.S. influence in the country and gain the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam. That being said, I think you also made a very good point that public diplomacy or cultural propaganda or cultural diplomacy cannot take the place of good leadership, and in the end, bad leadership will always trump cultural propaganda.
Or bad perceived leadership. It may be a good leadership, but if it's perceived,
well, if it cannot convince its own people that it's good, then it probably is not. I think Romania today, because we are in some way speaking of Romania today faces very similar problems. History in Romania is politicized, remains politicized, and it's used and abused in the political discourse. To that extent, I think there are two aspects, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, of cultural diplomacy as it relates to Romania, that it has, at least in my opinion, it has two basic facets. One, focusing on the outside of changing the perception of Romania on the outside. The other one is changing the perception of Romania within its own borders. The Romanian cultural diplomacy, at least as I see it today, and to some extent as it was exemplified during the Cold War, lacked a clear focus and a clear drive that may very well be something that is changing, as I think you're suggesting, but also as you suggested, I think it's going to take us a little while before we can figure out how effective that change actually is. In terms of the challenges that I see, and again, I commend you for the very interesting work that you're doing, and as I said, I very much look forward to the final product of it. I think as I see the challenges facing cultural diplomacy in the near and medium term future for the U.S., the basic idea of the so-called selling the American way of life, or the American idea, actually, of freedom and democracy, especially as it relates to people that continue to see the U.S. government as either the enemy or, at the very least, the power that backs repressive regimes and illegitimate regimes in the region will continue to be one of the major challenges.
Yesterday we were just talking at the State Department with the senior official who told us that the new approach is not selling the American ideas, but debating the American ideas.
Which is a way of selling it. I mean, they can call it whatever they want, but it's still, I mean, in the end, it's not selling the American way and the American ideals is not actually a bad thing. the problem that I think they're facing is that unlike unlike during the Cold War, when the American idea was adopted wholesale by the oppressed people of Eastern Europe, the people of the Middle East still need to be convinced of the existence of a shiny beacon up on the hill. It's not something that's that's properly accepted by the people of the Middle East, as opposed to the people of Eastern Europe who view their own governments as the repressive, illegitimate regimes, and saw the U.S. as the backer of freedom-loving people as opposed to those regimes. This is something that there's a disconnect within the Middle East that I see in terms of U.S. Policy towards the leadership of some of those countries at the very least, and U.S. cultural diplomacy in terms of democracy and freedom. For Romania, the two challenges that I've alluded to in a few minutes ago is just that. It's not just changing the perception of Romania outside of borders, which is the general idea behind cultural diplomacy. But I think the major challenge that Romania in particular faces is changing the perception of Romania within its own borders, changing the perception of Romania to its own people. I don't think changing the perception of Romania outside of Romania's borders can be accomplished or can be successful without accomplishing that first task of changing how Romanians themselves view their own country, and I'm hoping that the new activity, the emerging activities in terms of cultural diplomacy coming out of Romania will hopefully in the long term accomplish just that, but I think it's one of the challenges that they're going to have to face. And on that note, let me just open it up, and please feel free to ask any questions. Just not all at once.
I'd like to make some comments, because I agreed very much with what our presenters said. I have some real problems with what you just said.
Okay. There you go. There's the debate. Let's go.
Because I think there is a clear difference between debating the American way and selling the American way. And I think Americans have this real misperception about how great America is and how much in the leadership position it is. I first used an ATM overseas, long before they were available in the U.S. Cell phones were common all over Europe and Asia, long before they were common in the United States. The EU, the European Union, and Asian countries are way ahead of the U.S. when it comes to working on climate change and just improving energy usage. I mean, they've been ahead of us for a long time. And we have this myth in this country that the United States is the end-all and be-all, and we're not even close. But also, there's the whole thing you said, we're not at war. War is a myth. It's like a fairy tale. In a fairy tale, the hero goes through some sort of struggle, and in the end, he succeeds, and everybody lives happily ever after. And that's the myth of war. And war doesn't really exist. What exists is international relations. And every now and then, they turn violent, and we call that war. But once the violence is over, and the war is over, international relations continue. I mean, we don't all live happily ever after. Now, at the end of World War I, the victor nations didn't understand that. And a generation later, there was World War II. At the end of World War II, the victor nations did understand that, and there hasn't been a major world war since. And, just last week, I guess, upstairs, somebody was mentioning the United States and other countries that agree with it, and the first two countries they listed were Germany and Japan. And then England came later. So, I mean, looking at war as something special is sure to confuse the issue. Anyway, I like what you said.
Thank you very much for your comments.
I have a question. Bogdan, I would like you to explain, do you perceive cultural diplomacy and cultural propaganda as being antithetical, or do you see a point at which they both, if they don't become converging notions, they can complement one another in the efforts to advance the cause? It can be a cause advanced not necessarily by an individual, but it could be an NGO and not necessarily a government.
Well, what can I say? Any cultural diplomacy campaign, can become, cultural propaganda, and any cultural propaganda campaign may be transformed in cultural diplomacy. Now, of course, there are emergencies and political events, when you have to persuade. Well, you cannot use, cultural diplomacy strategies, but cultural propaganda ones, which.
You mentioned earlier that you calculated a time frame of somewhere around 30 years to see kind of changes. I don't know the effects.
It's a generational change, and also the time framework. When you can have. I am basically a historian, so in 30 years' time, you can access the archives and see what's going on there, because otherwise, if you are reading, the official reports, we were both working on that on the last 3 months, and that there is only, the surface. So if you want to go deep, you have to go to the secret reports, and they are available, only, maybe not only in 30 years, so.
What do you think about China's culture diplomacy in recent years?
Can you repeat the question, please?
What do you think about China's cultural diplomacy in recent years? Right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, China, I think, is a typical example of a big country with an underexploited, cultural diplomacy potential. However, there were initiatives, but it's still far underexploited, in my view. Anyway, the Olympic Games, in Beijing, and this kind of approaches, are the fact that the Chinese communities and diaspora is growing all over the world. These are facts, proving the fact that a country like China is stepping further, on the right direction. But it's still underrepresented.
As a matter of fact, what do you think of the role of the diaspora within cultural diplomacy, and how do you see the role of the government in a cultural diplomacy versus the role of the expats?
Well, I mean,
if you were to recommend to the Romanian government that this is how you accomplish the mission of making Romania the land of choice.
No. Basically, the cultural diplomacy of a country has to address, his message towards a foreign audience, because the cultural diplomacy of Romania for many decades, was the Romanian cultural institutes or the Romanian embassy were rather, clubs of the diaspora, of a certain kind of diaspora. So I think the message has to be addressed to a foreign audience, not necessarily to the diaspora as such. Of course, the Romanians, both inside Romania and in the diasporas as well, have to recognize themselves on the message or on the image promoted by the institutions like the Romanian Cultural Institute. But the message has to be addressed, to the target audience, which is the foreign public. And as far as the diaspora is concerned, the Romanian state or the Chinese state, need to be not the promoter of certain actions, but the facilitators of the individual initiatives, of the NGOs initiative, because those kinds of initiatives, have the power to multiply them by themselves naturally, without being perceived as propaganda.
on that note, then thank you, Bogdan. Very
Thank you
much
also.
appreciate it, and I hope you had a very good stay and very productive stay in Washington. As I said, I look forward to the final product, and I thank all of you for joining us today. I hope to see you again. We have another batch coming next year of Romanian scholars and quite a few events on the docket. So join us online at woodrowwilsoncenter.org/HAPP, and see you then. Thank you.